We are live. Hello. Let me check something. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Hopefully, I think I started. Get rid of that. There we go. Sorry about that. I clicked on two links at the same time. That's not what we wanted. Hello, everybody. Welcome to part two. I am exhausted. I'm just gonna say that right now. I did not get that much sleep last night. It may look like it. I am so incredibly tired. She would try to let you know. Please check to my streams. Okay, correct creating a new broadcast, and then we add it view on Twitch. Give me just a second. It's just I want to make sure that everything looks good on Twitch right now. We're streaming. Yes. There's an ad. Hello. Let me think of a icebreaker question. What do we want our icebreaker question to be? Okay, so yep, it's working. Cool. Gonna exit out of that. Welcome. All right. So what should our icebreaker question? I'm so bad at these. What's a good icebreaker question? Let's say, I already did the what would you do in a different life? That's such a good question, though. I love asking that one. What would be a really good question? Oh, I guess let's just do like traveling. If you could travel to any place right now, where would you go? Let's do that question. I'd love to hear it. Where would you want to go if you could travel anywhere? Anywhere in the world. Welcome. I think we're live. We'll give a few more minutes for people to hop on, and then we will get started. Let's see here. Ooh, Japan's fun. We love that. I think I remember. Yes. Oh, Monaco. Yes, we love that. Monaco, Japan. Where would I go? I feel like I ask the questions, but I never really think about where I would actually go if I were to do this myself. I've always thought about going to New Zealand. I don't know what it is, but like just going to Australia just seems like such a foreign world. Because I'm in the U.S. right now. Cities, as you can. Oh, by the way, they all you can see the. Hold on, how do I do this? Like project. There we go. Cities, all of the cities in the background. So it'd be nice to be able to go somewhere that's like not in the U. I mean, obviously not in the U.S., but a different continent. So either New Zealand or Japan is a good one. I want to go to Japan. I've heard really good things. I have my older sister. She took Japanese while in high school, and she went to Japan, and she had a fantastic time. So, or maybe somewhere in like Europe. I've already been to London. London was fun. Hello for people hopping on. I just asked the question, where would you go? Where's like your dream vacation or dream destination? That was our icebreaker question of the day. I'm going to wait one more minute before we get started. Also, if I'm having so many brain fog, so if I sound delirious at some point, like I'm just gonna blame it on the lack of sleep because I literally drink like I mentioned it last time I streamed, but I can't. I like drinking coffee, but I can't drink a lot of it. I think I have to drink like half the amount that the normal. I think it's like 8 ounces or like 16 ounces. I have to drink half of that because if I drink any more, my eye starts to twitch like crazy. And so I'm just very sensitive to caffeine. And so even though I'm exhausted right now, I can't even do anything about it. But that's okay. Okay. All right. We have a pretty decent crowd, so I'd say let us hop on. Hello, people hopping in. I'm going to share my screen, or add to the stream, I should say. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to part two of the technical interview prep track. So in I guess I can just keep going. I was going to talk in advance, but I can just show the slide. All right. In part one, which was a couple days ago, we covered interviewing basics, the background, and we talked about behavioral interviews, covered all of that good stuff. Now we're actually going to get to the fun part. We're going to get into some code. We're going to start talking about technical interviews. what that means and how the different types. We're going to go into a little bit more detail than what we had done last time. And at the end, not at the end, but in the second half of the stream, I'm actually going to be working through a few coding problems myself. Some of them I've kind of already looked at, some of them I haven't, to really show you the process. I was struggling a little bit a couple days ago to figure out what type of content I wanted to, like what my curriculum was for today, because I wanted to create something valuable, right? I wanted to create a stream for this topic that's already pretty saturated. Like, I mean, you could look up how to succeed in technical coding interviews, and there's a lot of content out there. And so I really thought about what I could do that was, though, provide enough value. And I think the direction that I'm going to head with it is I really want to kind of show the step-by-step process, what I'm actually thinking about when I'm doing an interview. There's a lot of learning resources out there about, like, how to, apply a linked list or a dictionary or, a stack or a queue. But I wanted to show it from a perspective of a student who's done a lot of interviews. So then I can provide all of the resources and ways that you can learn, while on your end, you're actually able to watch someone in real time tackle those problems and kind of use that for your own strategy. So that's kind of how I'm going to approach it today. First hour is going to be a little bit more talky, just kind of we're going to go over the framework that I discussed last time. We're going to go over just some general tips about interviewing for technical interviews as opposed to behavioral. And then the second half, we're going to start actually doing some code. And today's focus is going to be on strings, arrays, and dictionaries. My opinion, these are the most common data structures and algorithms you will see for interview, particularly for interns, and possibly full-time as well. Full-time will probably get into that part 3, but when I was interviewing for internships, I mentioned this last time, I think I had like 2 linked lists and 1 tree. Let me know in the comments if you had some of those like more advanced topics. I'm going to be covering dynamic programming at the end, and I'm really curious if anyone's actually had like a dynamic programming question for an interview, because it seems unheard of. I've never heard of somebody, especially for an internship, getting that. So if you had something like that, or kind of tell me like what data structure provided the most difficulty for you, like what was like the hardest interview. I'd love to hear it, because I tried to break it down into that. So I tried doing the most common / easiest ones for part 2. Part 3, I forgot stacks and queues. I made this list. I was kind of going over all of the data structures and algorithms I wanted to cover. And I was like, I feel like I'm missing something. And I realized, I was like, oh my God, I completely forgot. Like I remembered strings, but like I forgot like stacks and queues. I added that to part 3. Technically, in terms of ease, it would have fitted a little better with part 2, but we're spending a lot of time today going over interviewing fundamentals. I didn't want us to be crammed. So part 3 is going to be a lot less talking, maybe like 15, 20 minutes, and then we're just going to go straight into coding. And part 4 is mainly going to be algorithms, and then a little bit of some other advanced topics that you might see. I may or may not do a coding example for that one, just because I haven't seen it. I don't know anyone who has. And then we'll just do a wrap up. And so those 2 will be Thursday and Friday at this week, same time, 8 p.m. ET, pretty consistent. So that is what we're going to cover today. Welcome for those coming in. We are just about to get started. Water. Always got to have my water with me. All right, let's get into it. So the agenda for today, I always like showing an agenda so that people know where we're going to be headed. We're going to cover the disclaimer, always aka legal. I'm not gonna go into too much detail since I covered it last time, but I'm gonna go over the disclaimer. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time with like my background, but just for any new viewers, people who maybe weren't there for part 1, just wanted to give a brief introduction as to who I am. Then everything else will start to be new. So we're gonna cover interview programs and formats specifically for technical interviews. We're going to talk about that interviewing framework, go over some of the resources, tips and tricks for each of these different data structures. We have a lot of resources. Today is really going to be, if I want to get better at coding and leveraging these data structures, where can I go to do that? And so that was a question that I got a lot last stream. And so I'm going to be sure to cover that. Then we're going to actually do some technical interviews. You're going to watch me basically use the framework that I discussed in real time and what it looks like for someone to actually do an interview. Obviously, it won't be exact. I don't have somebody asking me questions, but I'll do my best to emulate it. And then, of course, at the end, we'll leave about 5-10 minutes for any questions people have about me. But feel free to ask questions in the chat if as they arise, and I will do my best to answer them. All right. Disclaimer. I updated a few of these. And so, there's one thing I didn't update. I'll get there. I updated a few of these. First things first is I am not the source of truth and I'm not a recruiter. And so I've done a lot of interviews. I have a pretty good idea of what goes on, but obviously I haven't been on the other side. I don't want to be speaking on behalf of any particular recruiter from any particular company. These are all my observations. And then, so take everything with that with a grain of salt, do your own research essentially. Coding will be in Python. I am fully aware you can choose any language. For the most part, you can pick pretty much any language you want. I mentioned a GitHub link. I'm not going to do that. I thought about when I wrote this down, I was going to have like a GitHub link that linked like different resources. I have a better way. I'm just going to show you the resources rather than like link you to them. And then you have to take an intermediate like step to get there. It'll make sense when we get there, but no GitHub link. But all coding will be in Python. I'm not really going to be covering the basics of coding. Like I'm not going to be going over what is a linked list or what is a dictionary. I'm really going to be focusing on the application of it. So assuming that you know what they are and you have some idea of what they do, I'm going to go into detail about the different functions and methods that might be most useful during an interview and how you apply them in that context. US based, of course, I'm from the US, and so I can do my best to answer international based questions, but just know that's not my background. NDA, this is probably the most important one. It wasn't really important last time, but it's important this time. Will not be sharing NDA content from company interviews. I will do my best to share those experiences with you, but I won't be saying, oh, Google has these interviews and prepare for this. I want to make sure that I do my best to kind of adhere to those NDAs. And then, of course, my thoughts and opinions only, not speaking on behalf of anyone other than myself and my experiences. Cool. All right, we're going to breathe. I'm not going to do the whole like going in a line of, oh, I went here and then I went here and then I went there. We're not going to do that. I'm just going to jump straight ahead to, hi, I'm Governess. I recently graduated from the University of Minnesota. Born and raised in Minnesota, Midwest girl all the way. And now I'm currently working as a software engineer. And so, here's kind of my path and all the interviews that I have done and all the interviews I have failed on the left side, specifically the offers I received but didn't take, and then all of the offers that I have accepted throughout my time in college. So that's giving you a snapshot of I've interviewed at big companies, startups, unicorns, academia, non-academia, fintech, regular tech, kind of been touching all over them. So that's kind of a little bit about me and my background. So just wanted to show that there. All right. We flew by that a lot faster. I think last time we did the stream, it took me about like half an hour just to get through like those first few slides. And now we're here, we're like 13 minutes in and we're already jumping ahead. So I'm excited. We can cover things a little faster now that we're on part 2. So the types of programs, I did cover this in part 1, but I'm just going to review that very quickly. It'll all be the same for technical. So you have your typical internship, you have your co-ops, which can give you credit depending on your school. There might be programs for that. So talk to your school if you are interested in a co-op. Alternatively, you could just do a traditional internship in the fall or the spring. The difference between a co-op and an internship, I didn't really cover that very well, is that a co-op is usually part of a program of your major. Usually you can get college credit for that. Sometimes you can get paid for it, but it really depends on the program. It's really funneled through your school. While in an internship, there might be some companies like Meta, for example, they just might have fall internships and you can apply. And then, you can fly out there or you can work remotely. And so the difference in practice, they do the same thing, but just some of the minutia of, you can get credit. Is it through your school's program? That's kind of the difference between those two. Fellowships, they're usually run by a third-party program, but, some things like MLH fellowship, for example, that can serve as an internship. And then, of course, there are programs for specific years and demographics, so maybe for first and second year only, or for underrepresented students. We kind of covered the huge list. At the end of last session, we covered a lot of different companies that had these programs. Just to summarize, I believe it was Google, Facebook, and Meta, whatever. Microsoft has Explorer, Twitter, I believe like Duolingo, Bank of America, Capital One, Palantir, MLH is for you can apply at any time. There's some other programs like Code 2040 or some other like fellowships that you can apply for. Yeah, there's a huge list of programs that you can apply for if you're a first or second year. I highly advocate for freshmen and sophomores doing internships. This gives you more time to learn and grow, and your year in school will not define what internship you get. It's purely, can you provide value to the company? I always advocate that. Cool beans. All right, so now we're going to go into a little bit more detail about the different types of interviews and kind of how they're all set up, how they work, and how to, general, like, when you go into an interview, what should you expect for each of them? So first, I didn't really cover, I got rid of all of the non-technical ones from part one, and I'm just going to be going really in detail about what they're looking for in each of these particular segments based on my experiences, of course. So we have the technical assessments. So these are typically after like a recruiter interview where they check accessibility, eligibility, excuse me, saying, hey, are you eligible for this role? Do you fit the criteria at its basic level? And if so, then they will pass you to the next stage, which is a technical assessment. Typically, they do this because it's a really big company. And so they just need, there's just not enough people to actually do one-on-one interviews. And so the technical assessment is a great way to kind of test, to really isolate that skill they're looking for while doing it en masse. And so there are a lot of different sites that do that. You all heard about my gripe with Byteboard and how I've just failed at Lyft's interview. I'm still looking for somebody who's passed that interview. Please out yourself. I need to know that people exist so that they pass that interview, because I haven't. And I don't know how. I know how. I failed it, but you know what I mean. Code Signal, Codility, things like that. These are these third-party sites that companies can host questions through. Sometimes in the case of Byteboard, it's very specific. So Lyft will have their own particular set of questions that they ask interviewees, while other things such as Code Signal, I believe, like companies like Asana, and like I think there's another one too that use them. They usually just grab the questions from like a word bank of all the questions they could select from, and they select it randomly. How it works is that they will send you a link saying, hey, you're invited to do this challenge. You have until X day to do it. Always keep that in mind. That usually, though, like I know Google does that too. They give you like a week or so, maybe a few days to do the challenge. And so please have that time like on your calendar. Know that you have a deadline. Question is, not question in the chat, but just a general question is, can you push back that deadline for when the technical assessment is due? And the answer is probably not, but there's no harm in asking. As I mentioned, technical assessments are really just a way for a lot of students are applying, and so if they gave everyone an extension, that kind of defeat the purpose. And so, in my experience, they tend to not give you extensions, but they have if you ask for them. I think there was one time I interviewed at a company and I completely forgot the deadline. I just forgot about it. And I emailed them saying, hey, is there any way that I can get this again and I'll complete it by end of day today? They were like, no problem. And they sent me that link again. So no harm in asking, but don't bet on, oh yeah, they're going to give me an extension. That's kind of how they weed students out, is knowing, are you on top of your work? Are you able to complete a task within the deadline? That's a pretty basic skill that, when you're working in the corporate role, are you responsible? Are you reliable? Can you be given a task and complete it on time? So please complete your technical assessments on time. When you open up the technical assessment, you will see some like embedded IDEs. So, in Byteboard, they'll kind of show you the questions, and then we'll talk about the format of how those questions are when we go over the resources, but it'll show you the question, the restraints, the input, the output, and then I usually show you a space where you can actually type your code. In most cases, you can select your language. I think there was only like one interview where I haven't been able to select my language. I think they made me do Java. I think it was just a Java-based company, and so they didn't give me the choice. I alwa+choose Python, but just know, for the most part, most of the common backend languages you can select, Java, C++, Python, JavaScript. I don't know. It's probably I can look. When we go to the resources, we can see that list. So just know that you can select your language, and we'll cover more about that in tips. So you pick your language, and then you start working on the problem. Usually there is a time limit, so they'll say like you have 90 minutes to do the problem, and after the 90 minutes has passed, regardless of how much time you spent, they will just stop it wherever you're at, whatever you've submitted or tested. They'll just submit the assessment as it is. So please keep time in mind. Make sure you practice good time management when doing these problems. Okay. So then also another thing that's not on here that I should have written out. Don't cheat. That should be a given. Just don't cheat. Sometimes the place can determine whether or not you're cheating if they're able to see like, okay, this person moved to a different tab, or some of the sites have plagiarism checks like embedded inside of their checks to see like, oh, you grabbed this code from this online site, it has like a certain similarity matching to something that's already posted and is public. And so you're not going to get away with it. Chances are you're spending more time trying to find the answer and then trying to edit the answer to make it not seem like it's cheating than just doing the problem yourself. And if you get caught, you'll get in a lot of trouble. Not only will you will just not get the position, and then also there are issues. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about like being blackmailed from a company, which if you don't know what being blackmailed or blacklisted, sorry, not black. No, a company's not going to blackmail you. Blacklisted is what I meant to say, is when a company basically says, okay, that person's done something wrong, or they've done something that doesn't align with our values and ethics, and they're no longer able to apply. So whenever they see your name, they're just going to be like, nope. Have I been blacklisted? I have no idea. That's not something that you really know. But you don't really want to take that risk. And also it's important that recruiters move around. So a recruiter at Google might be a recruiter at Twitter in a few years' time. And so you don't want to leave a sour taste in somebody's mouth, because you might think, oh, I cheated at this Google interview, whatever. I'm just never going to apply to Google again, and it's all hunky-dory. No, that's not the case. Sometimes you might apply to Twitter, and then you find out that Google recruiter that found out that you cheated is at Twitter now. And now they're like, oh, yeah, I remember her. Yeah, we're not going to hire her. So long story short, don't cheat. Just if you have to cheat for the problem, for the most part, you may not be fully equipped to do the role. Now, I know I opened a big can of worms there. I know there's a lot of discussion on whether or not the technical assessments are fully representative of the tasks that you're going to be doing on the job. And for the most part, I disagree with that notion. I think that, you can still excel in a job. Hello, seeing people hop in. Hello. We're just talking about the different types of interviews, and I went on a tangent. I think that, you can still excel in a job without the technical interview matching what you actually do on the job. But it's just don't cheat. I don't know why I'm trying to justify it. Just don't cheat. It just saves you time, saves everybody time. I do not condone that. So, okay. So how do you actually get scored? And so how you get scored on these technical assessments is that when you submit your code, it has to pass a series of tests. And those I think in some specific technical assessments, they'll tell you, I think it's like HackerRank or something like that. They'll like tell you they'll tell you some of the tests, but they won't tell you all of them. In some assessments, you might not know any of the tests. And some of these tests can be, for example, one, does the code work, and does it based on a test case, does it actually produce the right answer? Time complexity, so you don't want to be writing really slow compiling code, because then at that point, if it takes too long to run, then it'll automatically just time out and say, hey, nope, you failed. So just keep that in mind. I know that in phone interviews or maybe face-to-face interviews, people usually say just kind of get a brute force solution, something that works, something then make it more efficient later. That is only half correct in technical assessments, because you don't want a solution that's so inefficient that you don't even see that it works, and that's what will happen. So please make sure that your whatever code you write actually runs. And then they test certain edge cases, such as, okay, is what happens in this very specific scenario? Does their code work for these minute situations, or does it only work for the majority at large? And so with those tests, they might have 10 tests, and then generally it's like you have to pass a certain percentage of those tests in order to pass. So if there are 10 tests available, you need to pass at least, 8 of them. I'm just throwing an arbitrary number. The number depends on the company. Number to pass. And so and usually it depends. Sometimes that's a hard limit, and sometimes that's a soft limit. I've seen companies where it's like, you get a certain percentage, and you might have people, if you're not at 70%, you don't get it. I've also seen companies where you might get 100% pass all of the test cases and you still don't get the interview, while some people only get like 60 to 70% and then they get the interview. Why does that happen? No clue. I'll be honest. I don't really know why that happens. I'm sure they're probably that in that case, they're most likely looking for, code quality, or maybe there are other supporting elements of their application that maybe made their 60, 70% outshine. And so I don't fully know. It's not really, you won't really know when you do the technical assessment what they're checking for. And so my biggest thing is, if you think that you've only gotten like, oh, I didn't pass all the test cases, does that mean that I don't get the interview? Not necessarily. And also on the end, don't assume that you're automatically going to get the interview because you passed all the test cases. There's just a lot. It's kind of all one big gamble. Another question that I get a lot is, should I leave comments? And so with the technical assessment, while you're writing the code, you could leave comments. And that's actually one thing that I do recommend. So say, for example, you don't finish all of your code, or you don't handle all of the edge cases in time. What I would do, rather than just submitting incomplete code, is I would just write a comment saying, hey, in this scenario, like pseudo code, here is the logic that I would be implementing in order to do this particular thing, so that at least shows the recruiters and people who are looking at it, hey, this person, they didn't get to finish writing the code, but at the very least, they understand the logic of what's going on. I've done that before, and that's been, I passed interviews where I've only gotten like 50, 60%. I don't know if that's attributed to the comments, but that's something I'd always recommend adding comments. You'll never really know whether or not the recruiter's looking at it, or if it's, sometimes nobody's looking at it. It'll just be run through a machine. And so there's some arguments that say, hey, comments are useless. But sometimes they do look through it. And so I'd always err on the side of, if you just don't know what to do, leave a comment. So that's all technical assessments. So assuming you pass that and you go on, typically you tend to go on to it can go two ways. Either you go to the final round, which is just the coding interview, or they might do a phone interview with you. And so both of them are essentially the same. The difference is that a phone interview usually leads to like an on-site, or, more interviews to come. Phone interview, as the name describes it, they'll call you on the phone, and usually you'll go to like a shared document. I've done like a Google Docs coding assignment, or we'll hop onto the same like platform, and we can see each other's code and our comments, and you're literally just on the phone while you're writing the code. And so it's not that much different than, video, except, they won't see your face in that specific scenario. But both of those formats are essentially the same of, okay, here's a problem. Please implement the solution with code in, however long. If they give you half an hour, you have to do it in half an hour. Typically, there's not like tests associated with it in comparison to the technical assessment. That doesn't mean you can't account for the use cases. And we're going to cover all what you should do during the coding interview in a second. But just note that you will be writing code and submitting it, but chances are you won't be running it against any test. It'll just be the interviewer looking at it and being like, interesting type of thing. In terms of how you're scored for these interviews, obviously I'll go to I think I kind of did it from like least conventional to most conventional. So of course, technical capability. Can you do the problem? There have been situations where sometimes I've had interviews where they have three interview problems that they want to give you. And in order to pass, you need to complete like 2 or 3 out of the problems. And so don't ever I had this mistake where I completed one problem, and I felt so good. I was like, oh my gosh, I did it. I completed the problem. I felt really good about it. I took the whole 35, 40 minutes to do it. And then I got rejected. And then I found out that there were more problems, and that the idea was you needed to be faster. I should have completed that first problem in like 10, 15 minutes and then try to do the second problem. So just keep that in mind. Once again, you won't know whether or not they had that, but just note there are some interviewers who are like, they expect you to complete a certain number. They might give you an easy problem to start and then expect you to do that and then see how you handle the more difficult ones. Some interviewers might just give you one problem. It all depends, but those just things to keep in mind. Technical capability, of course, can you complete the problem? Completeness, as I mentioned, you want to always try for the brute force solution. You want something that works. You don't want to leave with a half-done efficient solution when you could have had a completely done inefficient solution. And then if you have time, then you can try to make it more efficient and cleaner over time. But I would always say complete the problem for get the problem working, because that's what's going to get you to the next part. Not there's some like minutia of like, oh, this person's a problem solver, they didn't finish it in time but they knew what they were doing. But for the most part, they want to see that you have problem, that you solve the problem. All right, here we go. I see a question in the chat. Were the coding interviews you've done related to learning data structures and algorithm, or more on solving a problem more openly? Good question, and I've had both. And so I think it really depends on the company and what they ask you. I've had, and it was Stripe. Stripe was another company that I've interviewed like 3 or 4 times, and their interviews are really, really tough. And Stripe always has those like interview questions where they focus on, like, there are some companies that give you questions that relate to, the field that they're in. So Stripe is more like fintech and more like financial based. And so they'll give you a problem that still utilizes data structures and algorithms, but it's more so of like, hey, here's this bigger world problem. How can you incorporate code in that? There are some other companies that do that as well. So I would say both. Typically, I would say it's like a combination. You still have to use data structures and algorithms, but they like hide it in the question in a way for you to see if you can answer it yourself. So it's not like implement a dictionary that does this. Usually that's not how they word it. Usually they give all this, like when you're doing a math problem or a physics problem, and they give you all of this context that doesn't really matter. It doesn't really contribute to the problem, but it sets up the story, and the underlying question behind all of that is utilizing X thing to do it. So hopefully that answers your question. So answer is kind of both, really. So then we talked about technical capability, completeness, and then communication. Can you communicate what you are doing? So I've talked to people who, I've talked to people who have completed technical interviews and they solve all the problems, but they still don't get the offer. And there could be a lot of reasons for that. I wasn't in the interview, but one thing I tend to think was the culprit was the lack of communication. You can't be sitting there in an interview, typing, clickety clacking, doing a coding, and then not saying a word, not talking to your recruiter or not talking to the interviewer, not telling them your thought process, not talking out loud. Those are all things that you need to get into a habit of doing, especially if it's digital. In person, you should still do it, but especially digital when you're not like side by side and they can't see what you're thinking or what you're writing down. It's very important that you explain your process. So you're kind of multitasking. You're not only solving the problem, but you're also telling them what's going on in your head as you're solving the problem. And they want to see, can you communicate in high stress, under pressure? Can you also be thinking about the problem at the same time? So those are how you're scored. Now, there's a lot of other like smaller details, but those are kind of the big things that they check for. Then there is learning interviews. This is kind of a more niche category depending on the company, where they give you a new technology or software. How fast can you learn it? In terms of how you're scored, really it's, can you learn the software without having any context beforehand? That's really the most important part, is that they're not going to expect perfection. They're not going to expect that you're a master at whatever language that you're learning in the next 30 minutes of that interview. What they're asking for is, okay, we know that you're just learning that. How well are you with asking questions and seeking solutions when you don't know the answer to them? I think asking the questions is such a big part, because if you don't know how to use the language, you can't just be sitting there being like, I don't know. You can't just say, oh, I don't know how to use it. You have to be resourceful and say, okay, I don't know how to do this. What did they give me? Talk to the interviewer, see if you can get stuff out of them. So that's one big part, is like, can you go from nothing to something? And then sometimes they do X amount of problems similar to the coding interview. It just depends. And then finally, the topic specific interviews. Once again, this is a niche topic. How you're scored is essentially, do you know your stuff? This is probably the most academic, quote unquote, interview out of all of them, because chances are they're just going to ask, like, can you describe this theorem? Or how do you apply this, this concept in this context? And so that's really them saying, okay, if they're going to be hiring you for a machine learning AI position, they kind of expect you to know machine learning and AI. I talked about before how, in coding, typically, you can go into a job and if you don't know the language, they can kind of teach you that. For some of those more specialized fields, they kind of expect you, if you're applying to a job to be an expert in something, they expect you to be an expert in it. So in terms of internships, I don't see these topic specific interviews coming up that often, because they expect you to kind of be a jack of all trades more or less, and then kind of specialize as you go. But maybe in terms of maybe full time, or if you have a very, very specific role in mind, you might come across these questions. So that was a lot of talking, but I really just wanted to go through, if you were to have any of these interviews, making sure you understand, what you're going into. All right, I told myself I'd start the coding at 1 hour, and so we're about half an hour in, and I'm like, okay, we gotta keep it rolling, because I don't want to be talking the full hour like I did before. I do want to get us to the code, so I'm gonna try flying by the rest of this. Can you give an example of what jobs gave you the learning interviews? Great question. Let's go back to my list. And so the learning interviews, I had one. I'm trying to figure out which ones did I have it in. I think I had one at DeepMind. DeepMind is like a small company, like it's like a sub company. It's like part of like the ABC family, where they gave you one. I don't know if it's on this list, but I had one that I had to learn like a program, like it was a made up programming language. And they basically were like, hey, you need to learn this language and like use it to like solve these problems and these queries. And so I don't think any of these ones, like I said, I don't think it doesn't come up a ton based on all the ones that I'm looking at right now. Qualtrics, Qualcomm, no, none of the interviewers, nothing from Salesforce, Coinbase. I did. Oh, no, never mind. I thought I was a learning interview. It was just I didn't know what I was doing. There was an interview. I will say I'll cover this later, but there was actually I'm going to save this story for later because I have a story, but it's not related. To answer your question, I don't have none of the ones that I've applied onto here has like a learning interview, at least that I remember. But yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about you're gonna like come in. I think it's very, very specific to the company. So yeah. So I wouldn't worry about it. I just bring it up because it has come up before, and sometimes that can be really intimidating. Like, how do you prepare for an interview where you don't know what they're going to ask you? And the answer is you don't. If you come into that situation, you kind of have to come. I think the biggest skill that will aid you in those interviews is it's answering questions, being curious, and taking initiative and saying, hey, I don't know how to do this, and like being resourceful. That's what I would say. But no, don't worry about it. It doesn't come up very often. All right, so the flow, I kind of showed this before. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but today we kind of talked about the technical assessment. I'm not going to go into like a technical assessment at length. I feel as though when we start going over like the resources, I'll show you what's similar to a technical assessment, but we're really going to be focusing on technical interviews, and then on-site is going to have a mix typically. Sometimes it'll be 3 coding interviews back to back. Sometimes it'll be 1 coding, 1 learning, and 1 product. Sometimes it'll be a behavioral and a coding. It really depends on the on-site. But just note that if you have like an on-site, which is going to the company in person, or it might be called a super day. So just keep in mind those might be several interviews back to back. Prepare for a long day. I think the most interviews I've had to do for a job was, let me see, I had the recruiter interview, I had the phone interview, I had 3 like on sites. That's 5. I had a second interview that was like more like behavioral, so 6, and then I had like another interview after that, so 7. I think the most I've had were like 7 interviews. That was a lot. And I actually didn't end up getting that position. That's the most frustrating part. You go through all of those interviews, and then I didn't even end up getting the job. So I'm not going to out that company that did that, but that I have had that experience. I do know people who've had that experience. That was for an internship. That wasn't even for a full-time job. Like insane that I had to do that and didn't get the job. All right. Now let's cover the interviewing framework. So there are many frameworks for this. This is what I would recommend because I've used this and this has worked so well for me. I'm going to grab the link that describes this process more in length. If you want to read more about it outside of this, let me grab that link. Let's see. If you guys have heard of Codepath, which I highly recommend. Let me post a link here before I start talking too much. Okay, what to do? I see that question. Give me just a second. So I'm going to post that. Okay, the question is, does interviewing get any less scary with practice? Ooh, that's a good question. I will say it's very much like running or like doing any physical sport. You get better at it over time and you get more comfortable when you can go farther and you can just, your output's just a lot better in the long run, but it doesn't ever really get easier. It's always, I think the idea of being in an interview is always stressful. You're always, you always feel like you're on, people are just watching you. And I think over time, you certainly get more comfortable with doing interviews, especially as, once you start learning, once you get more comfortable, like different like questions that they might ask you and you kind of know how to answer them, that gets better. But being in an interview is always, and it's inherently a stressful situation. So I would say it does get less scary because you get better at it and you know how to navigate it. But if you're feeling stressed out, like an interview's coming up and like your heart's racing and you're getting like the jitters, that's completely normal. Like I said, I've been doing interviews for since before even college. I was doing internship interviews and it still scares me. Even now, I'm going to be doing like a mock interview in front of you guys and I'm scared to death because it's like I pick the questions and some of them I kind of know what to do, but some of them I'm kind of going to be freeballing it. And I'm like, oh man, I hope I don't like mess up in front of all these people. And like, so yeah, it definitely doesn't, it gets easier, but the feeling, the stress, the anxiety, that can be very real. And I think the only way to navigate that is, the techniques you can do to calm yourself down, to keep yourself grounded, and just to trust that you know what you're doing. Hopefully that answers your question. It may not be the best answer to hear, but it's the truth. It's the honest truth. All right, so I sent a link that was provided by Codepath. And so if you don't know what Codepath is, let me actually see if I can look it up and read the actual description of what Codepath is. I've done a Codepath program with them before. And so let's see. So I'm just trying to find what the actual definition. Here we go. Ooh, they updated their website too. Actually, I'm just going to share with you this website. Sorry, I saw this website and I was like, because I've been on this website before, but it looks really good now. They like ramped it up. I'm very impressed. But Codepath is a nonprofit organization that focuses just on preparing you for getting a job. Literally, that's like their entire goal. All they do is they focus on getting you, what does it say? Technical training, career guidance, mentors, community, and it's all free. Everything is free in Codepath. I've done programs through them. There's a technical training like for the summer, and I've done it. And they have a lot of like partnerships with companies such as Meta, Salesforce, Walmart. I'm reading the website. Workday. Who else do they work with? Comcast. I don't know if anyone's interested. Comcast. They have a partnership with Google. They have a lot of partnerships. It's a really cool program, and they had kind of coined this framework that I recommend. I learned about it my sophomore year, and I use it all the time. It's called umpire. And umpire stands for, as you see, understand, match, prepare, implement, review, and evaluate. And so we're going to go over all of that. And so understand. So basically, when you use this framework when you sit down in an interview. So I'm like, hi, the person's like, how are you doing? We get all the small talk out of the way. And then they give me my problem. First thing I do when I see a coding problem is I try to understand it. You kind of do this inherently, but breaking down the steps before is one, understanding the inputs and the outputs to the problem. So if they're asking me, I need to return a certain thing, I need to make sure that I know, okay, what type, what data structure am I returning? What exactly do they want me to return? What are they giving me to work with? understanding the edge cases, and understanding the question itself. Honestly, backtracking a bit, make sure you understand what they're asking you, because there are a lot of times where people just jump into the question and they don't even know what they're asking for. And so please take the time to understand the question, even if you have to have them repeat it. That's totally okay. Edge cases. So understanding, okay, you understand you have to submit you have to return a certain thing. What are the other, there's probably the obvious answer, and then there are all of these side answers. So what happens, if the input is empty, for example, what should be returned? What happens if the input should be a number, but it turned out to be a character? So some of those, that's why the clarifying questions come in so much handy, because asking these questions allow you to get a full scope of the problem that you're working with. And I'm going to show examples of that with the interview coming up, so that you see what types of questions I mean. Then match. So this is a very quick, internal. So what data structures and algorithms fit the problem? Have you done it before? So if they're asking me to reverse a string, in the matching phase, I'm thinking okay, have I done this problem before? How have I done that? What functions or methods should I be using in order to do that? Obviously, there's a reverse function, but is that the best approach? So really just kind of you're talking out loud saying, hey, here are, based on this question, this seems very similar to this type of problem, or I might use this type of approach. So that's what matching is. Preparing is the this is the stage that I think people need to spend the most time on. And funny enough, they tend to spend the least amount of time on it. I think you should be spending just as much time preparing to solve the problem than you are actually implementing the code. So when I say prepare, that essentially means you kind of know, you understand what they're asking for. You kind of have an idea of where you want to go. This is where you really start talking out your approach. So you start talking out, okay, so I have this input. Here is everything that needs to happen to it in order to get the results that we want. So I probably need a for loop here that does these things. I need to create this data structure that does this. If this input comes in, what should be coming out? So this is where you talk out loud. This is where you develop the skill of, you're processing what to do, but you're also saying it to the person. And so it can be scary because you're like, oh, you're just spitballing. And what if your spitballing's wrong? But it's important to talk out loud so that they understand your thought process. Because they're not just hiring you for your technical skills. They're also hiring you based on, can you solve problems? And that's what coding is, really. So talking out loud, and then also confirming your approach. One thing I do at the end of every interview of this section is I say, I think that, okay, for reversing the string, I am going to create a temp variable, or, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to a temp variable that does all of these things, and then it's going to return this. Does this make sense? Am I good to proceed? That's always a good question to ask, because the interviewer is usually there to help you. I don't think I've had many interviewers who sit there stone-faced, not saying anything, not really wanting to help you. That's not really what the interviewer does. I'm going to switch tabs because there's this huge glaring white light in my face. Interviewers typically are there because they want to help you, and they want to be there as you solve the problem. And so use them. Don't just let them sit there. Use them. And so I always say, tell them your approach. Ask them, am I on track? And 95% of the time, they're going to say, yep, that's a good approach. Go ahead and do it. Or maybe think about it more. Maybe there's an edge case or two that you're missing, and they might guide you to the right solution. They can't help you if you don't tell them what you want to do. So that's why this prepare step is so important. Yeah, it is nice. I would say most interviewers do that. I don't think there's been an interviewer where I've been like, oh, is this the right approach? And then they just stare at me. You know what I mean? They don't really do that. And so I think we need to get rid of this mentality of the interviewer is on your side. As scary as it seems, they are there. I mean, the only reason they're most of the time, interviewers aren't interviewing you because they're being held at gunpoint and that they don't want to do the interview. They're doing the interview because they care about recruiting, and they want to get students and people in these jobs. And so they want you to succeed. So please use the interviewer as a resource. Don't neglect them, because they're the ones who are going to make the decision. Then we have implement. So I don't need to explain that. You write the code. I recommend talking out loud while you write the code. Don't just sit there, once again, on your keyboard, typing away and not saying a word. As I'm writing out, okay, I'm going to make this for loop. I'm going to write, for I in range. Okay, how long do I want the range to be? So I only want to go halfway, so I'm probably going to do like the length divided by 2. You know what I mean? Like literally as you're writing the code, you're talking out loud so that they can hear it. It's a little uncomfortable, but you get used to it over time developing that skill. So that's when you implement the code. The last two, I would say not optional, but it really depends on how much time left you have in the interview. And these last two steps, it's what's going to take you from being a good applicant to a great applicant, which is why I add them. The first one is review. So checking for edge cases and syntax errors and testing the IO manually. So this literally means if they're giving me an input of hello and I need to reverse that string, I should literally go through my code line by line saying, okay, I just saved this one as a variable. We're going to go through this for loop and we're going to start at the letter H and then we're going to swap it with the letter O at the end. Like literally like going through the entire debugging step. You should be debugging your code out loud so because that's how you're going to catch it. You definitely don't want to write your code and then be like, done, I'm done, I don't want to do it, that's it. Don't do that. You want to at the very least go through your code at least once, check for any errors, check to make sure that it's clean and that the logic does what you want, and then test the output and make sure that if you're inputting it, you walk through the logic. Don't just assume that it works, and then you might be able to catch a bug. I might go through the loop and be like, oh shoot, that's not doing what I want to do, and so then that's how you catch those bugs. So make sure you review. And then finally, your recruiter might prompt you for this. They might not. If they don't prompt you for this, it just makes you look better if you just do it naturally, is evaluate. So this is when you talk about the time and space complexity. So, okay, this has, O and N squared, runtime, whatever. And, space complexity, it's constant space. So it's O to the 1. You know what I mean? So this is where you just kind of talk about the output of your code and then other approaches. So if you had a brute force solution, this is where you say, okay, if I had more time, here is what I would have done instead. And then you talk about what you would have done in that situation. So that's the umpire method in its entirety. I know it's a lot. And the first time that you do it, it's going to take a while to get used to, okay, now I'm in understand. Now I'm in match. Over time, the more you do it, the more comfortable you'll get, and it'll just come naturally. I see a question in the chat. When reviewing, can we put print statements to check if the processing is producing the right numbers? Yes, you can do that. And so that most likely will only work if you're doing like an online interview where you actually have the IDE. If you're doing a whiteboard interview, obviously you won't be able to put your print statements in because you're writing it. And so I would still I like having the print statements. I still recommend doing the debugging manually, just because if you do have a whiteboard, you don't want to become too attached to print statements, and then you have to go on site, for example, and then you have to debug it, and now you don't have those print statements. So if you have access to them, I think that's a great way to debug. However, either way, I think you should still do it manually, just so that if anything, not only does it help debug, it also helps to ensure that you know what the code is doing. You're not just writing the code on autopilot saying, oh, it shows that, you're able to think through each step and understand, if the line says that you need to, enumerate, what the enumerate function does. You understand what it's supposed to review manually. But to answer your question, yes, you can do that. All right, we're coming crunch time. I said an hour, and I gotta keep it going. All right, general tips. I'm gonna some of these I kind of covered already, but some of them are just like in general. Leverage your network for interview prep. What I've done, I think it was for DeepMind. I had actually reached out to people on LinkedIn saying, hey, I see that you're working at this position. I really love to learn more about the interview process and what can I expect type of thing. So, and that's a totally fair question to ask. Sometimes they won't respond. Sometimes they'll ghost you. I've had people who ghost me before, and that's okay. They're not entitled to a response, and there is certainly tact to it. I've had people reach out and just say, hey, please tell me how to pass this interview. And I'm like, I don't know you. So you kind of have to build some rapport. Don't just reach out, like I said, it takes tact. Don't just be like, gimme the secrets. But also, if you're connected with them, it's perfectly valid to ask them about the process. That's why you're connected. So I recommend if you have an interview coming up and people who've done the interview, getting information from them would be helpful. I buried this point to the ground, talk out loud. that is going to be like the number one thing. The interviewer can't help you if they don't know what you're stuck with. So please talk out loud. Sending follow-ups and thank you emails, those are a little bit underrated. You should definitely do these steps. After my Microsoft interview, so it was an on-site and there were 3 interviews, and I had I didn't have the names of each of them, so I just emailed the recruiter saying, hey, I had interviews with like these 3 people. Can you like tell them these 3 things? And I literally wrote something unique for each of them because we talked about stuff after the interview. We just had like a nice conversation. And so I told them like, hey, I really enjoyed our conversation on these things. Thank you so much for the interview. I really appreciate it. And, I got the offer and I was there for a summer. I don't know if the thank you note was contributing to that, but it certainly puts a good taste in someone's mouth when they're, respectful of your time and your energy, and also that you're reaching out. It allows your name to be in their brains when they're making that decision. And so I would do that within 24. I would do that same day, honestly, same day or within 24 hours at the latest, sending that follow-up email. Don't be afraid to seek confirmation from interviewers. I talked about this. They're there to help you. You should certainly ask questions for them while they're there. I haven't been in a situation where I asked an interviewer something and they just didn't respond. So please leverage them. I see a question. Should we provide a thank you email after every step of the interview process? Good question. You can. In my experience, I've tended to only do a thank you email on the final round or like the on-site. The main reason for that was because that's one where, it took the most effort, and it was kind of like a cumulative thank you because I kind of sent an email to the recruiter as well saying, hey, thank you for this entire process. And, I thank the individual people. So you can do it after every stage. Is it overkill? Maybe, but, it's polite. It's courteous. There's nothing wrong with it. I personally only do it for the final rounds, and, it's the make it or break it moment. But there's nothing wrong with sending it after every step because, once again, it just makes you look better. So I should start doing that. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. I don't like the idea that like interviewing is a numbers game, but it kind of sort of is a numbers game. You're going to get rejected. You saw my list. I don't know why I have to keep going back to. You see my list. You see how many interviews I got rejected from in order to get offers. It took forever. It took forever I interviewed all these places, maybe every and there's more. There's more that I haven't even listed here. It took like 10, 15 interviews for maybe like rejections for like one interview, not even counting the offer. And so I would always recommend, everyone has that dream company that they want to work for, and I respect that. And it's important to note that especially for these bigger tech companies, it is going to be very competitive. And so you never want to just say, oh, I'm going to work for Lyft. And unless you're even with the referral, you can get rejected. You can get rejected for so many reasons out of your control. So always have backup. I think I applied to 50 to 100 companies before I got my internship. So yeah, don't wait. Don't feel like you have to apply to one company. I see a question in the chat. What resources would you recommend for getting started? Great question. I think that's next. I think that's the next slide. Yes, it is the next slide. And we're going to go over those resources too. I said we're going to take an hour before we go to code. We might take an extra 10 minutes. I'm sorry. There's just so much content. All right. Pick a coding language and stick to it. Highly recommend this. I picked Python as my language, and the reason you stick to one is because you'll get better at it instead of doing Python. Don't pick a language because you think a company is going to like it more. They don't care. They really don't care what language you use. So pick the language that you're comfortable with and stick to it and master it. I picked Python and I just kept getting better and better at it. And then I knew the different functions that I needed in certain situations because I just stuck with the language so long. So I would just pick one. It doesn't matter which one you pick. You can do Java, JavaScript, C++ if you want. I don't know why you'd pick it, but you could do it. I see the question. I'll answer that in a second. But yeah, pick one language and stick to it. Did you personalize your resume for each of the 50 to 100 applications you sent? Great question. And the answer is kind of not really. People recommend, adjusting your resume for the roles that you're applying for. And I agree with that to an extent. I think that if you're applying to different roles that require different skills, you should certainly adjust your resume to accommodate that. However, I'm empathetic to, and I was there, empathetic to the idea that no one has the time to sit there and update their resume for every single application. That is unreasonable to ask. I don't every person who like offers to do that, they don't actually do that. I don't know somebody who has like all of those different resumes. What I would recommend is if you're applying for software engineering roles that have similar skills, which typically tend to be, Python or Java, or, maybe some from framework like React or Django or whatever. Those I kind of have categories. So I would have like a software engineering resume and I'd use it for software engineering roles. Now, if there's a role that had a very niche like skill, like I think there's one that was like if you know like some data engine, like if you know some R or SQL in addition to like software engineering, I would then cater it for that. But I kind of had like a software engineering bucket. When I applied to product manager roles, I used a separate resume for that. And then I didn't really apply to any like data engineering. I did UX design for a hot minute. And when I say a minute, I mean a hot minute. It was not very long. When I did do that, I had a resume for that. So I would recommend doing it by categories, not by companies, because nobody has time for that. Of course. Nope, that makes total sense. All right. Way to kill, and kill I mean in a good way, your technical interviews. Practice, practice, practice. I compare doing interviews for code for like software engineering roles the same as studying for an ACT or a GRE. How you do that is you understand what the test in this case is going to be like. You do practice problems that kind of get, because they all kind of have a similar format. I would say for the most part, technical interviews all have a certain format, except they might just change the wording and, the context a little bit. Understand the format, understand what they're asking you, do a ton of practice problems, and then, when you take the GRE, you've done so many problems. The test looks the same, except they just changed some of the questions and some of the numbers. Similar for a coding interview. Most of the time, the questions that they're going to ask you, like in terms of like what string-based questions they're going to ask you, they tend to all kind of fall in a similar category. So if you know how to do 2 or 3 different string questions, you kind of know how to do all of them. Now, the difficult part is the identification, making sure that you get to the interview and you understand what they're asking you. But once you understand what they're asking you, the actual code tends to look the same for like each category. So like there are only so many linked list questions that they can ask you that you can do in 60 minutes. You know what I mean? And so I would say practicing makes perfect. The people who succeed in these interviews are the ones who practice and take the time. We're going to go over those resources like next. Don't auto reject yourself. Apply for the role. I didn't think I was able to apply to half of the roles that I did, and I did, and I got them. And so don't count yourself out before you even try. The last 2 are very important. There's more to luck involved in technical interviews than you think that there are, and so don't take rejections too personally. There are so many factors that go into why you get rejected. One of the obvious ones could just be, maybe you bombed the interview. That's a very obvious answer. But maybe they gave you a very, really tough problem. Maybe they gave you I know there's some interviews where they gave me like, a stack and queue problem, and then they gave the other person like a graph problem. And so there's luck in what problems you receive. There's luck in the interviewer that you get. Maybe you get a really easy interviewer versus someone who's a bit more stoic and difficult, to read and not work with, but like do an interview with. Maybe it was just the end of the day and they're just tired and they're not paying attention. There's a lot of reasons why they might hire somebody over another. And so don't take it too personally. As I mentioned, it's kind of a numbers game. But then the last point is learn from your mistakes and rejections. You know what's worse than failing a linked list interview is that failing that linked list interview again because you didn't learn from that mistake. So while I say don't take it too personally, use every interview as a launching pad to get better. I would say in terms of like getting better, you can't stay complacent. If you don't know something, you have to learn it. Right, those are all the tips that I have. And then now we're going to go into the resources, how to actually get started in learning and doing all the things that I'm saying. So water break. All right, let's do it. The resources. We're going to go through them. The first, and my thoughts on each of them. So the first set of resources that I recommend are the ones that allow you to practice doing interview questions. And so you have things such as LeetCode, Algo Expert, HackerRank, Hacker Earth. There's a new one that I found recently. It's called Coder Ninjas. That's actually a really good one. In terms of my opinions on all of them, I think LeetCode's the best, mainly because of they have a very large database of questions. It's very well organized. You can use it for free for the most part. I think in order to get some solutions and some of the more like active, like, like being able to engage with like educational content, you have to pay for it. But if there was any of these that you wouldn't want to pay for, LeetCode would be the one that I would say pay for. I know people who they share an account with somebody and then they just each of them split the yearly cost and then they just use it at different times. So I would recommend LeetCode because I just think the number of questions that they ask is the most robust out of all the options. And like I said, to get better at interviews, you have to practice. And so I recommend the site that gives you the most practice. Algo Expert is a kind of a newer one over the past few years. It's certainly been rising in popularity. The way it works, it's very similar to LeetCode, but it has more video-based content. So it really walks you through how to do the problem with like a video to kind of supplement what you're doing. So it's really good for guided learning along the way. The only downside is that there's not like a free version of it. You do have to pay for it before you even get access to the site, which kind of sucks. And so if you're like on a budget and you just you want to just practice problems, or if you don't really care for the video edition, you don't really need Algo Expert. But I know people who swear by it because they can do a problem, and then Algo Expert, they explain the problem and do it via video. Like instead of just like submitting it and then they're saying, oh, it's right or wrong, they literally walk through the steps. It's such a good tool. If I was in a better state financially when I was a student, I would have done it. But it's life. HackerRank, I would recommend for if you are trying to get better at a particular data structure or algorithm. The way that HackerRank works is that rather than having like a ton of questions, it kind of has these like certificates or preparation kits. And so what that means is that you can go in and like, oh, I really want to get better at this particular skill. Like I want to get better at solving linked lists, for example. And what happens is that HackerRank has these like tracks that you can take to get better at that one skill. You can do that for languages. I think there's one for there are preparation kits that have like challenges or problems, but they kind of just mix everything together. It's a lot more like collaborative. You can do competitions, there are challenges. And so it's a good resource. I used it a lot. I would say in terms of the database of questions, it's not as robust as LeetCode. But if you're trying to learn a very specific skill, or you want a badge, or maybe you just want to learn a different language and get started on something, I think there's a topic of algorithms and you can go through those challenges. HackerRank is a pretty good choice. And then finally, you have Hacker Earth. I didn't use Hacker Earth that often, to be honest. I think the only times I used it was like, when did I use it? I don't think I used Hacker Earth that often. It's a good resource. It does have a lot of good questions on there. I just don't, in comparison to LeetCode, I just didn't really find the need to use it. So those ones, yeah, HackerRank has really cool videos on YouTube. Yeah. Oh, yep, that's our next one. We're going to cover cracking the coding interview. I have heard that they have really good videos as well. And so all of these resources are good. All of them have their place. It really depends on personal preference. If you want like governance certified opinion, I think that like LeetCode, if you want to just get better at problems, if you have a good baseline of how to do data structures and algorithms and you just need practice, LeetCode. If you're more of I need to learn the basics of data structures and algorithms, I go to HackerRank. And then if you prefer a video-based approach to learning how to do problems, I would use Algo Expert. And then Hacker Earth is just another resource to use. I haven't used Coder Ninjas. I've been on the site a few times. I love it. I think it's a great site. And so I didn't add it to this list because I didn't use it in college. But if you just want another resource, I'd recommend Coder Ninjas as well. So online resources in terms of like learning. So the ones above are kind of more of like practice. Code Wars. I haven't actually heard of Code Wars actually. Let me look that up. I've never heard of it. There's probably like a ton more that are in online, and so don't feel limited based on what I told you. Achieve mastery through coding practice. Okay, it's 3 million people. It's a lot bigger than pretty big, and I haven't heard of it. For developers, okay, so I'm not going to log into it just at this point, but the website looks cool. I do like the website. I like the dark mode website with like the colors. I always think it looks good. Okay, so yeah, there are so many resources on here. Let me look at it a little bit. Start coding. You have to create an account. Okay, maybe at the end I'll create an account and kind of look into it more, see if it's certified. Oh, you can complete and earn. Ooh, okay, okay. I might add that to my list. I'm gonna store that. I'm gonna add that to my list just because even though I have a job, it's always good to just practice interviewing, and so I'm always on the lookout for new sites that teach me that. Online resources that you can do a deeper dive and actually learn. So if maybe you're coming in here and you don't know, maybe you're just not good at making trees and you want to get really better at making a very specific type of data structure. Some resources I recommend: free code camp. It's free. What was it? Geeks by Geeks, Geeks for Geeks. That's what I mean. That's another one. I should have added that on there. Geeks for Geeks is, I think that saved me in college. I used Geeks for Geeks so often. It's such a good read. They break, not only do they have practice problems, but they like break down and they do it by certain languages, certain like types of problems, certain data structures. It's a really good resource. I don't know why I didn't add it to the slide. So I recommend free code camp. I haven't used Educative.io too much. Let me go back to it and see what. There's something about it that I like. I was doing a little bit of research before I started, and I think it's because they also have videos and it's like hands-on. I forget. Let me see. I like the website. I don't know. I always judge whether a website's good or not based on like how like pretty it looks. I know that's not like the best way to determine if something's a good resource, but if they take the time to make a really good website, usually that means their product is sound. And so doesn't seem like it's free. Seems like you have to. It's not too expensive. It's 16 like US dollars a month. But still, I tend to. I don't think you need to. Another question is: do you need to pay for the? Like, do you actually have to pay for these resources? I think no. I throughout college didn't pay for any of these resources except for Leak Code, and I think I did that like my junior year when I was like heavily like internship hunting. Like I was like full on, but otherwise everything else that I used for preparing was free. So I don't feel like you have to spend money. You don't have to spend money, but if you want to, they're available. They certainly give you a lot more bang for your buck. Cracking the coding interview, a gold standard. Everyone talks about it. Don't bother buying it. I have the PDF. Let me get you the PDF right now, just so that we get that out of the way. Hold on, cracking the coding interview. I know some people. I know it's an ugly link. Ignore the ugly link. It works. So that's cracking the coding interview. That just want to make sure you guys have that. It is. I think I used this for my I think I used it the morning of for my interview with Microsoft. I literally was like the morning of. I was flipping through it, like panicking, like oh my god, I don't know what I'm doing. And so obviously everyone talks about it. It's a fantastic book. In terms of how the book is structured, it takes a while to load. So if you get a PDF, over 700 pages, so you might have to wait a little bit. In terms of how they break it down, is that they kind of go in detail about the different interviews. So if you want to learn more about, oh, they have Palantir on here. I didn't know they had Palantir on here. Great. But if you wanted to learn more about the different, I think Palantir did have a learning interview. Sorry, I don't know why I kind of blanked on that. Yeah, somebody had asked, what companies have you done learning interviews with? Palantir had a learning interview. I knew there's like one of them on there. It teaches you like the different interviews that are going on, as well as preparing for behavioral interviews. It goes into a lot of detail about Big O. So if you don't understand Big O, this book is really good. And then what they do is they break down questions by data structures. And so they kind of give you very common questions that might come up. So like say, for example, a linked list in chapter 2, it has like, creating a linked list, deleting a node, recursive problems. God, I hate, you might have noticed I don't have recursion on here. I think I had recursion once for an interview. What interview was it? I think it was for one of my startups. I worked at a startup and I did get the offer and they asked me a recursive problem and I almost wanted to cry. It was so bad. I don't know how I got that offer. So I guess another thing, should you expect recursion? I think I saw it once and I somehow did it. I don't have it on this list because I can barely do recursion. I don't know if I can teach you guys how to do recursion. But any whoosies. The book breaks down by chapter the different data structures. It's definitely it's a combination of teaching you it and then also giving you practice problems. And and it also goes over some more advanced topics. So, Dijkstra's algorithm, if you want to, I read block trees, AVL trees. I didn't see any interviews that had those types of trees on there, so I wouldn't worry too much. But it's a really good book. Highly recommend it. Gold standard. It's free. I do have the pacing through it and clicking in. Love this book. Yes, please, yes. It's such a good book. Such a good book. Really, really, really good. I do have the physical version of the book because I didn't know there was a PDF version. Now, granted, the book's not that expensive. Well, actually, before I eat my words, let me double check to see how much it costs. I don't think it was incredibly expensive. Oh, it's like 35, 40. It's like $35 US. So certainly it's. Oh, actually, no. Paperback is $21, and then if you want like a newer version of it, it's like $35. I see. Okay, so I guess it depends on whether if you buy it new or used, but you shouldn't have to. Just use the PDF. All right, and then YouTube videos. In terms of teaching you material, some people just really take the time to teach you, and that's really great. There's so many good channels on how to learn how to code. I think I've watched a few of them, and so definitely YouTube is always great. And then GitHub repo of other people doing coding problems. You could just Google like practice coding problems and GitHub, and you'll just find a GitHub of people they just have their own GitHub of practice problems, and then they can work through it. That was something I was going to do, but I'd rather go through the practice. And I was going to do like a half, you guys work on it and then I review. I didn't want to do that. So that's why I didn't do like a GitHub link. I decided to just do it all live. So, but yeah, those are, in terms of resources to get started, those are more than enough in terms of practice. So whether or not you're at a stage where you want to learn more about the data structure, or you just want more interview questions, this list kind of has a pretty good representation. And if there are other resources, feel free to add them to the chat. This is not exhausted by any means necessary. So there's certainly a lot to learn. All right. So then the next one we have is resources for these particular things. And so let me get the links for these. I thought about it. I was like, why did I not get the links? I should have put all these links on a single document so that you can actually see the links instead of putting them on the slide, because you can't see these. And so I'm not going to go into detail about every single one of these, but essentially there's a big I am going to take the big O cheat sheet, because I think out of all of these links, this is the most useful. And also, just like part one, I'm going to take the link of this PowerPoint and I'm going to put it in the chat at the end of this stream. So if you want to get access to this, you want to see all the links, all the resources, review some of the content, you'll have this. So you don't have to worry about it. You'll get the links. I should have just put it on a separate page. But anywhoosies, the Big O cheat sheet is probably it's a lifesaver. I love this cheat sheet. I think it's been here since my sophomore year of college. It's just been around. I'm looking at it right now, and essentially it just breaks down every single data structure, every single algorithm. And what it does is it goes through and says for every action that you do, it breaks down the average, best case, not best case. Well, sometimes average, best case, and worst case for each of them. So if I'm doing an array, if I have an array and I'm trying and I need to search an array, I know that the average and worst case runtime of doing that is Big O to 1. I know that because it's there. And so that's why, and so it has it for pretty much every data structure, every algorithm, quick sort, merge sort, tree. I haven't used tree sort. So highly recommend this cheat sheet. I recommend just memorizing the content on here so that because they're going to ask you in interviews, just memorizing these details. I know it's such a good site. I found this a while back and I'm so glad I can just share it with people. Memorize it. And so then when you do your interviews, they'll ask you, oh, what's the runtime of this particular action? You're like, it's this one, because you memorized it. So, yep. It comes up in pretty much every interview. And then on this slide, which you'll get access to, is really, and mostly because we're running short on time, I want us to do the coding. It breaks down some of the one thing in terms of preparing for, these types of questions. So, if you're like, oh no, how do I prepare for doing a dictionary-based question? One way to do that is kind of these cheat sheets or quick facts. It tells you what link please to what? Link to the Big O. The Big O link is I should have posted it. Let me know if there's a different link. I'm not going to post the links to all of these because I don't want to be spamming the chat with like 6 different links. You're going to get access to this at the end. They don't ask you to count steps when doing big O's on interviews. So they don't ask you to do that. I think you just kind of do that in your mind. So for example, if there's like 2 like for loops, you kind of like, if there's like a nested for loops, you kind of, at this point you should kind of know like, oh, that's, O to the n squared. So they don't ask you to do that, but they will ask you to like tell you what, the runtime is. And then they expect you to kind of either know it or process it and kind of work through it. And so I think you should just memorize it so you don't have to sit there and look at the code and be like, okay, what is accessing a link in it, accessing a value in an array? What's the runtime for that? Just kind of memorize the process and you can avoid that step entirely. But as far as I know, they don't really ask you to like count steps. I struggle with space complexity. I know it's not too difficult, but it's just something that they don't really ask you for space complexity that much. Well, they do, but I feel like in interviews, if they too dense, they always ask you for time. Sometimes they ask you for space. It depends on the interviewer. I've had both. I've had them not care about space and only ask about time, but I memorize all of it. In terms of preparing for certain data structures and algorithms, I would recommend like these cheat sheets or these functions. So particularly for strings, there are certain functions that you should just kind of know how to do, because chances are they're not going to be, in some interviews they might do this, but generally if they ask you to reverse a string, for example, they're looking for a little more than just you doing the dot reverse function and just, you know what I mean? They're not they know that you know the reverse function. What they want to know is, can you logic a way to doing it without the hardcore coded function in it? And so these functions are a really good way to, if you're working through a problem and you're like, oh, I need to make this lowercase. What's the function to make something lowercase in Python? That's what these functions are for. That's part of your practice. Over time, you'll kind of learn what functions are needed and which ones are not. So if I were to click on one of them, which once again, you'll get access to this at the end. I might actually put this in the chat earlier, but it'll tell you like, okay, how do you split? And it'll teach you how to split, how to join, how to count, all of these different functions that you can do. So, I've had a big old question on the first interview. Yes, yeah, they definitely, whether or not it's the first interview, a phone interview, they'll probably ask you. They probably won't ask you for a technical assessment interview, like what the big O runtime is, because unless it's like you have to input it in like a text field, but that I haven't seen that. So, but anyway, you'll get access to all of these resources. Highly recommend looking them over. Whew. All right, let me take a water break, and then it's time for actual code. Time to actually, let me get rid of this here. Now I get to see me. And so what I'm hoping to do now is I'm going to share the process of me completing a coding problem from start to finish, utilizing the umpire method that I described, what happens at each step, the types of questions that I'd be asking, and then obviously running the code, and also showing you what it looks like on the particular IDE and whatnot. And so that is what I'm going to do. And I'm going to try to do more than one problem, time pending. I know it's very late. If you're on the East Coast, it's like, I think it's like 8:30 my time, because I'm in Central Coast. So give me just a second. I just have to pull everything up. We're gonna do this one. So okay, let's see. I want to share a window or Chrome tab actually. Give me a second here. Missing numbers. This is what I want. Okay. And share. All right, so this is the problem that we're going to do. Now notice, actually, let me just do a leak code kind of like review in general, just so that, you guys can actually see what leak code is. And so the account, you can create an account for free. And what happens is when you get there, you have several options. You can explore. They're like, this is kind of like a forum, so you can post stuff here. They do challenges. There's a lot of stuff on here. And then the problems is the key thing. And problems, what you can do is it basically just goes this entire repository of questions. They rank it from medium, easy, and hard. How many people have actually completed it? They tell you which ones have solutions. If you have premium, they tell you the frequency, which means how frequent is this question being asked in interviews, which that's a killer. And then you can even categorize it by company. So maybe I'm trying to interview for Google. And okay, so you have to have the subscription, but maybe I want to interview for Google, and so I want the questions that have been asked in Google interviews, and it tells you the frequency of which they've been asked. Such a cool. This is why I love LeetCode so much. There are like the challenges you can do. You can get points. There is some learning. I tend to like HackerRank a little bit more for learning content. But they've really evolved this site, and then it keeps track of all the questions you've done. I know people who would like have it their mission to do every single LeetCode problem. So if that's the goal you want to go after, go ahead. And okay. So that's been it. Shows a lot of different companies. So if I'm interested in working at TikTok, for example, I can see the TikTok specific question. So that's why if there's any reason to spend money, it's probably just so you can see the company specific questions. You don't have to, but it's something you can do. So I just kind of wanted to walk through that. And then I'm going to go back here for a second because I want to go back to the missing numbers. And I'm going to try looking at the chat every now and then just so that I have a different tab up. So I might, go back and forth between like the chat and the code. All right. So the problem that we're going to be working on is missing numbers. And so how it breaks it down is this is also pretty standard for how the setup is for like a technical assessment, is that they're going to give you a description, the name of the problem, a description of what they want you to do. They'll give you some examples of particular inputs and outputs and an explanation. They cover the constraints, which I tend to not look at the constraints that much unless it's a specific problem that really like hinges on knowing the constraints. Usually I don't tend to look at them because, there's just so much content. You have so little time to do the problem. So you're kind of picking and choosing what's important. And then follow up, this is kind of more of like, can you do it better? You can see who's accepted, who's submitted. If you want to see the solution, there's like a forum for discussions and then your submission. And then on the right-hand side, you have your actual IDE where you actually type in the code. So I can choose my language here. So here are all the options. If you want to code in Kotlin, go ahead. You can do it. So and it updates it. So say I want to go to TypeScript, it'll update the format to TypeScript. I've never heard of Elixir before. If you've used Elixir, let me know. Some of these I haven't even used. Dart I've used. But anyway, you can choose the language you want. Python or Python 3 doesn't truly matter unless there are specific functions that only are available in Python 3. I'm sure there are. I don't usually pay attention to that. I just picked the most recent one. Then when you're ready to run your code, you can choose test cases, or you can choose the ones that they pick for you and then submit. We'll see whether or not it's correct or not. And this format is so they just have a class here. This is the function that they set up for you. And then if you want to, you have yourself and the list, which is, and they kind of told you the input and the output. So the input's going to be named nums, and it's a list of integers. And then the output, they're expecting just a single integer. All right, so that's kind of like the layout of how this looks, and this will look pretty similar regardless of what you're using. There's some changes in the UI overall. All right, so the question. So let's start like breaking. If I were to do this problem, if this was something a technical assessment problem had given me, how would I handle it? Given an array nums containing n distinct numbers in the range 0 to n, return the only number in the range that is missing from the array. And so then look at some examples. So in this case, they have nums, which has a 3, a 0, and a 1, and the output is 2. The reason for that is since there are 3 numbers, they're expected to be from like 0 to 3. And so the range is the n. So if there are 3 numbers here, then I am expecting to see 0, 1, 2, 3, but that's the case because it's a missing number. There's always going to be, my assumption is there's probably always going to be a missing number because of the way that the way that lists are indexed in Python, where it's like a 0th index. And so if there are like, if n equals to three numbers, it's going to be 0, 1, 2 and not 3. And so in this setup, there's always going to be a missing number because it's always one less than n. That's just one particular detail. Keep that in mind. And then they do the same for nums 0 to 1, and the outputs, 2 missing numbers, and then same, they give you a bigger example, there's 9. They all kind of follow, there's not like, in terms of edge cases, there not really is a ton going on here. But okay. All right, so now I've read the problem. Let's break down the steps of umpire. And so I'm going to do this via comments just because it's easy. And so the U for understanding, this is where I would ask questions about edge cases and, try to just get a better understanding of the question overall. So I'm going to use this for the multi-comment just so I can write some stuff down. And so I know that my input, some things you should be noting. I know my input's going to be a list or array, whatever. I know they're different. I tend to use them interchangeably in the context of this problem. I guess they technically call it a list, so I'm going to call it a list. I'm going to move my Grammarly. So I have Grammarly, and I'm going to move it out of the way just so that you can, there. So I know my input's going to be a list, and I know my output's going to be a single integer because we're producing that one number. And I kind of described it before. There's always going to be a missing number. So even in the case where the input is 0, then that means let me back it up. So that means n is equals to 1 in this case because it's the number, it has one distinct number. And so the missing number in this case, so the answer that I should be expecting, I should be looking for 1. So this is how I would break down use cases or certain edge cases to say, okay, if the input is this, here's what the output is. So this is a really great way to confirm with your interviewer that I understand the problem. I understand what they're asking me for because I know what the code should do and I know what the input and the output should be. So that's one that I recommend doing that a lot. So then I could do that again for, okay, I know. So then there are questions of, okay, a question I would ask the interviewer in this case is, what happens if it's empty, what should I expect? And you can ask them that. And they'll probably say, in this case, it's NA. You won't be in a situation where you'll ever receive an empty list. And I'm like, okay, cool. If they said yes, expect empty list, I'd have to adjust my code for that. Another input option, another edge case is what happens if I know that I would ask okay, what if it's a list of characters? So maybe it's A and B or whatever. And they're going to be nope, can't do that. It's only a list of integers. Seems like a very simple question, but you don't want to make assumptions. The biggest thing about understanding is really getting any assumptions out of the way and asking as many questions as you can to understand the problem. So in this case, I know that it's only numbers, or integers, I should say. I know that in this scenario, it will never be empty. Another question, I know that it's distinct. So another question I could have asked is what happens if the input's 666? I shouldn't do 666, 678. There we go. I know, I guess the whole point of the example is to show that it's 6, but I should have, it's whatever, 666. And then I know that's not a possibility because it asks for distinct numbers. Okay. Another question I could ask is negatives. Is negatives going to be involved in this? Is that going to matter? I would say no, because they're asking for integers, I would say. Is probably what they would say in this case. But here, there's kind of very basic edge cases that you can ask for every single problem. And so one edge case that I'd always ask for, if the input's empty, always ask about that. Ask about the type of the input. So, can it change? Ask about repeating numbers, ask about negatives. And, this can correlate to the strings as well. Should I expect a string to be empty? How about characters? Is it only going to be alphanumeric characters? Should I expect special characters? So kind of understanding those use cases, preparing them in advance. So then when you get to the question, I kind of ask the same edge cases in every question because, they're usually the same. So that's the understand phase. Let me write that down. Understand. So understanding is really asking these questions and understanding exactly what I should do. Then we have the set to understand. Let me double check to make sure I didn't miss anything. Like I said, usually I would pay a little bit more attention to the constraints, but I just tend to not match. So this is where I think, okay, have I seen a problem like this before? I know that it's going to be a list problem because that is the data structure that we're working with. There are some situations where they won't tell you what data structure to use, or they won't be as explicit when describing the input and the output. They might not tell you that it's a list. They might just tell you return the only number type of thing, and not, if you're whiteboarding, they won't have this nicely listed to you saying, oh, the input's a list. You kind of have to read the problem and make an assumption like, oh, it's probably going to be a list. Or don't assume. Ask them if it's going to be a list. So I know that in this case, because they told me this, that it's going to be a list. And okay, so if I'm thinking, if it's going to be a list-based problem, now I'm thinking in my head all the list-based functions that can come along with that. And yeah, so the matching phase isn't really, it's kind of mixed with the prepare phase. It's kind of just, it really is identifying the data structure you're working with, which is kind of obsolete in this case because they told us the data structure. Going back here. Okay, so I'm gonna go back. I see some questions in the comments. I just want to make sure that like I get there. She has like a super complicated version of guess who. Yeah. It certainly is. I think for this problem, I think it's an easy question in terms of like the leak code. Is leak code easy? So a lot of the questions I'm asking here are kind of convoluted because it's like they tell me all these things, but I'm trying to be as thorough as I can to show that like, hey, I'm asking all these questions. I'm, not rushing. The whole point is to show that you're not rushing into the problem. That's really the whole point of this step. It seems like a lot, but the whole point is to show that you understand it and that you're a problem solver, because that's what they're looking for is, can you solve problems and not just rush to finish code? The question here is, do you usually ask about time and space complexities to aim for? That's a good question. Honestly, I should ask that. I didn't ask that. In terms of like, in terms of the runtime, sometimes they'll tell you, I want this. I think in this case, they give you like, your goal is to do an O of N runtime. I think that's probably, so say in real life, I would ask them and they probably say the goal is maybe O and N, but in real life, I'd probably do a brute force solution and then maybe it would be O of N squared. And then if I had time to do it again, I would say, okay, here's what I would do to have it be better. And also one thing to note, if you already know the most efficient solution, you don't have to try to brute force it just to brute force it. Let me just clarify that. Brute forcing it is if like you just need a solution on the board and you don't have that efficient solution right away to start. If you already know the best way to do this, just do it. You don't have to go through the semantics of doing like, all the extra work if you already know how to implement an O of N runtime type of code. I just tell you to do the brute force if you're like, you're in an interview, you're stressing out, you're sweating a little bit, and you just kind of need to get something going. So just to clarify there. All right. So we kind of did understand. We did match. Now let's get into the prepare phase. I'm going to switch onto my keyboard here because it just makes me feel better. Instead of reaching over and typing, I can just kind of lean back. All right. So for the prepare phase, let me go here. What I would do, and obviously I am like drawing everything out. In real life, this wouldn't take this long. You would be going through these steps a lot faster, but I'm explaining it to you as you go. So it seems convoluted now, but in real life, it kind of flows a little better when I'm talking to an interviewer. And so what I'd be saying to an interviewer is, okay, I think I have some ideas on how to approach this problem. And so I've already identified that there's always going to be a missing number, and usually it's going to be and what I have to do is I have to run. And so I already know what the length should be in this case. I already know that the length should be like N is however long the thing should be. And so I need to basically check if I can check. I already know that I can run through the list from, we already know how to run through a list is by using the for loop or for iteration like method. And with that, I can have a counter. And since I know that the list is always going to be like, that's another question I should have asked, is like, is it always going to be input? If it's always going to be like in order, if it's going to be like 0, 1, 2, 3, if it's in order versus like 15, 28, 39, you know what I mean? Because that's a completely different question. And then in this case, they would say it's always going to be like not in order, but the numbers are going to chronologically be in order by the end versus the numbers are being random. This is a much more complicated problem to solve than this. So this is a good question to ask. Like, is it going to be incrementally adding by 1, or is it just going to be random? since in this case, I'm going to assume I'm the interviewer and they say that's incremental. So what I can do is, so say in this case, if it's like 0 to, it's like there's 2 and it's a 0 and a 1, based on this example problem, example 2, what I can do is I can create a counter that basically goes through. And so the counter will start at 0. Right? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to iterate through the list and spell that wrong. That's okay. And compare the values. I'm going to compare the values of the list to the counter. Right? And that's okay if I mess up. You see, I'm typing a little fast just so I can explain my thoughts. And so this can be pseudocode. In this case, I like to just write down what I'm saying because then I can just read it. But you can do pseudocode if you want to do, for fine, in range, whatever, length of list. And it's pseudocode, so you don't have to write the code exactly. And what I'm going to do is if the counter, if it doesn't match the value, then we know that that's the missing number. Because if we're going through, if n equals to 2, then that means the values that can be in there is either 0, 1, or 2. So if I have a counter, I'm going to start the counter at 0. I need to check if 0 is there. Okay, then we're good. If 1's there, then the counter increments by 1. Then I guess that's another step. Increments by 1. Then I check this. Okay, is 1 in the list? Yes. Then, okay, I need to check again. Is 2 in the list? Well, that's impossible because there's only 2 values in here. I know that 2 is now the missing number, and then I return that value. So in that case, I return value. And also the step is, speaking out loud is a really good way to practice explaining technical concepts to somebody. Typically, the person you're interviewing with is going to be an engineer, but sometimes they're not. And sometimes, maybe it's a language they don't know. And so this is a really good skill of like, okay, I just explained this. Like, does this make sense? If I'm explaining it to you guys, is my explanation of how I want this code to run, does that make sense? Because if it doesn't, then that's something on me to enhance how I explain my concepts to people. And okay, so then I would return the value. Otherwise, I want to increment counter. So that's going to be my approach to the problem, is I'm going to do all of this. And then at this point, I would say, okay, I think this is my approach. Does this look good? Can I proceed? And the interviewer would be like, yep, that looks good. You can proceed to code. So only after that step, now then do I actually start coding. All right, looking through, no questions. I would say that usually takes me the most part, and my throat's like, I'm sleepy and I'm dehydrated. It's a mess. All right, so now I'm free to code. So how do I want to approach this problem? Let me go back. So the only way that this counter thing would work if I were to go through 0, 1 is that they would need to be in order. Another question that I would ask, it kind of is similar to the first question, but I didn't, is the input going to be in order or is it not? And in this case, we're going to say no, not in order. That's an important thing you need to know. So that's another good question you should ask in general for edge cases, is if the thing is in order. Okay, so I know it's not in order, so I need to sort it first. So I need to sort first. Oops. I'm going to keep that bottom thing. What I do is I keep my prepare, like all my notes just kind of here. And basically the beautiful thing about writing this out is I can basically just take this and then just write the code based on what I've written here. So it kind of serves as an outline for me to do what I want to do. I'm going to check if any questions. I always got to double check questions because I can't see both. So then in this case, what I would do is, okay, I want to sort it first. So this is where the understanding the different functions that are available to you makes sense. And that's why that cheat sheet that you're going to get at the end of this is so important, is that I know in this case how to sort. I can do num, but I know that there's a function that just allows me to sort. And it does that, automatically. It'll just sort it. I don't need to set it into anything. But this requires you knowing that this sort function exists, because otherwise you're going to be sitting there and it's like, oh, shoot, I need to sort this, but I don't know how to sort it. And so that's why it's important to know the functions that you're working with and get a good idea, so that when you're coding, that's not your syntax, and the methods that functions that you're using aren't going to be a barrier to you when working on this problem. I also keep using like methods. Technically, this is like I guess it's like a function. I use methods and functions interchangeably. I know I shouldn't. I know I'm a bad coder. I shouldn't use them interchangeably, but they're kind of the same thing. And so, okay. So then what I want to do is so the numbers are sorted. So then it's also a good thing. It's kind of writing down the steps if you just need to. If you're whiteboarding this is a little easier. So say the input is 3, 0, 1. I now know that because this is sorted, it's going to turn into 0, 1, 3. So I'm always, and this is also really good. This is also good for the review stage. So I'm kind of doing the coding and the review at the same time. So I maybe I shouldn't. I'm gonna wait to do that because that's kind of the review stage, but I'll get there. And so, okay, so now I want to iterate through the list, and I also want to have a counter. And so there are two options that I could use for this. I could create like a separate counter. I could just, like counter and like set that equal to 0, and then it'll do that. But I don't know if I want to do that. I think I'm going to try to be fancy, and because I could just do like a for loop and then just, +1 if I want to. Or I could use something that's called an enumerator, and that will combine those two steps together. So this is kind of where you can do that brute force versus something that's a bit more efficient. I would say you could probably start with like adding a counter, and like counter equals 0, and then you can do like a for loop and loop through it if you want. Or you can do an enumerator, which combines those two steps together, which if you don't know what that is, I'll cover that in a second. And so I want the enumerator for I, and then what do I want to count by? I want to count by the, I guess it doesn't really matter what I call this. I'll just call this like num in, I think it's like enumerate, and I want to enumerate through the nums. And I'll do that there. And so questions. Okay. Oh, there's a question. I don't know. I literally looked at the questions, and then I'm like, I don't know the question. Would you also have asked about mutating the input data? That's a really good question. That's actually like such a good question. I should have asked that. So yeah, whether or not you can that's on it. That's like array number 1 that I completely missed, is that you should be asking, can you edit if it's mutable, can you edit the array that you have, or can you produce an entirely new array? Typically what they're going to say is that to edit the array that you have, so that like you can just like, it's more efficient rather than creating more space to create an entirely new array. But in this, I think what I'm doing is I'm already editing it, but that's a really good thing to ask, is like whether or not you can create something new or if you have to edit what you have. Really, really good question there. So then once I do that, so how enumerate works is you, instead of setting up 1 value, you set up 2 values. Maybe I shouldn't call this num. So I'll call it nums. So you break up the iteration. You basically do the counter in the same step. So for I is the counter, and then num is the actual value that you're going in. So it's kind of like a for I and n combined with the for I in range. It kind of does both steps at the same time. I love enumerate. It makes me feel smart when I'm doing it, because people are like, oh, what's enumerate? And I can explain it to them. So that's why I love doing enumerate. So as we talked about, we want to iterate and then compare the values. So we're already iterating through the values. It's already sorted. And in this case, we're going to start with the value 0. I am going to put a comment here just so I can, for my own sanity. And so basically the counter is, what would happen is if it equals the number, then that means it exists. So you could do it 2 different ways. You could do it, if it equals it, then continue the loop. But an easier way to do it is, I'm just going to say if it doesn't equal it, then we know that's the value we want, and I can just break the loop right there. Because we know that the value of the list starts with 0. I guess like that's another question I should have asked. I think I did ask that, if it always starts with 0. And so we know that I will always start with 0. The list will start with 0. And so I can just kind of, if I is 0 and the list starts with 1, then we know that 0 is the missing number. And so with that logic, I can just skip it to here. So if I doesn't equal, if the counter at any point doesn't equal the num, because the counter and the num should be together based on the sort, then what I can do is then I can just return, oops, I didn't do too much. I can just return I. Don't return num, because the num's not what we want. We want to return the value that's missing. And so if, in this case, if I equals 2 and num is 3, we don't want to return 3 because 3 is not the missing number. You want to return the missing number, which is I. And I guess this is kind of okay. So this is kind of like a random step. Is that we? So say for instance, it's this. This is kind of another edge case I should have listed here, but I didn't. Say the list was in this case. So I equals 0, I equals 1, I equals 2. We get to the end of this. Well, shoot, the missing number is 3. This logic doesn't really account for that because it's only going to go up to the value of the list. And so kind of an edge. So it's kind of, then I kind of create like an else statement if I wanted to. I don't really have to. In this case, I would just say like return. I would just return like I plus 1. Because I plus 1 is going, so if this ends up being 2, I can just plus 1 and get that missing third number that we didn't add here. So yeah, but sorry, I'm looking at like the comments as I'm like coding, and so oops, sorry. Yeah, I messed that up. Does not equal. I know how to code. I promise. I promise. I promise to know how to code. Thank you for that comment. That was useful. Okay. So this is the logic then that I have, and so that ends the prepare side. So now here is the implement. Then the review. So review would kind of be like, okay, my input. You don't have to do this. You could say this out loud, or you can write it down. In this case, it makes more sense for me to just say it because it's here. So we get an input of 3, 0, 1, and then literally just I go line by line. Okay, it's gonna sort it. So then now I know that the next piece in here is gonna be. It's going to be 0, 1, 3 because we've sorted it. And then we'll get rid of this. We know that I is going to equal 0 in this case. And then num is going to equal 0. And I'm not going to, and then I can do like I equals 1, num equals 1. You know what I mean? You basically just go through each step. And so in this case, these are both 0. So this doesn't work. It goes back to the loop. Then I can update it and it's 1, and that's going to be 1. All right. It doesn't break it. We're still good. And then now, this is the fun part. It's 2, num is 3. Now we know that if I doesn't equal num, it doesn't. We know that 2, and we can look at this and be like, this is an easy test case where I can visibly know what the answer is. So I know what it is. And so you want to pick a test case for your review that you know obviously that you know what the answer is. Because if you don't know what the answer is, then you're not really sure what you're testing. So I know it should be 2, and this just validates that. And in the off case that this was, if it was like 0, 1, 2, then I could test and see like, okay, I want the value to return 3. That's what this does. So that's what that's the review step. And so then the last one is evaluating time and space. What I tend to do is I just print out a comment for like time and space. All right, time. Gosh, and also one thing I suck at big O notation. Is this big O? Is this O of n? I think this is just O of n, right? Because I basically I have to run through all the values in the list, and we already know from my big O. I'm going to look at that big O document. You won't have access. Also, another thing, people try to have like different tabs open during the interview. Don't do that. It's so obvious. Just don't do that. People will know when you're looking at it. But in real life, I look at that and be like, okay, searching through an array gives me an O of n worst case runtime. Cool. I know that the checking of like the two values, that is constant. And so I can semi-confidently say, I say that because I suck at O of n. I suck at runtime. I'm just not very good at it. I can say that that's O of n in this case. Sort is n log n. You're right. You're right. I completely forgot about that. And so, I messed up my own Yeah, I completely forgot that it's n log n. And so, but I know that this part run is n, and so then it's like some like O n log n. I forget the addition of that. Is it just like, would it just be like 2n? So this is where my this is where my knowledge stops. This is when you all look at me and be like, oh, does she really know what she's talking about? Because I'm like, I'm not very good at it. And so add together would that just be 2n log n, and then would I just ignore the 2N there in that case? Yeah, or just log in. I guess it's like the smaller of them, or not small. Yeah, the bigger of them is always the biggest. Yeah. I'm looking at the list. Yeah. So this is exactly. This is why you should study in the runtime, because I'm not good at it. Okay, and then space. Well, we didn't create anything. And so we sorted it, but we didn't create any extra data structures or algorithms with that. And so I do think that is, well, maybe actually, what was it? It was just like a normal sort, though. I think it is just let me double check. I want to believe that this is O of round 1. Let me double check the list. I actually don't. I'm actually not 100% sure if it's just if it's constant, because the list, we didn't change any. We didn't like add a list to it. We just changed the list that was there, so we didn't create any extra space. I just don't remember if the algorithm, the sorting part, adds space to it. I don't think it adds space. I don't think it adds the space. And so I am going, I think it's just O of 1, right? I'm looking at these because some of these like do add space. Like if you did a quick sort, it would be, what was it? O log of n, but I don't think that's the case in this one. So, and it's okay if you're wrong. I think that's one thing. I mean, because what I was doing when I was very wrong, when I was trying to do like the like n log of n, and I was like O of n, that's something good to show the recruiter, because at least then they'll be like, actually, it's just n, and it's okay. It's okay to not be 100% perfectly right. You don't need to strive for perfection. You just need to show your process. So in that case, if I was working through it and they'd be like, try again, that will be okay. As long as I was in like a general ballpark. So, okay, so that is, and then that's the evaluate. So then I'd say, it's time and space. And if you were to do a assessment, what you would do is you would run the code. And, okay, so then expect, I always forgetted that. I'm sorry. Okay, give me a sec. Did I get rid of this accidentally? I think I might have gotten rid of that. The little like dot, the def line. Yeah, I think I gotten rid of that accidentally. Yeah. What was I doing? I don't know what I was doing. I think I was just like fiddling around with it. Oops. Class solution. Invalid syntax. What am I doing wrong? Where should that be? I'm gonna cheat. I'm gonna do something. Should it be at the very end? Hold on a second. Hold on a sec. Simple syntax. I'm failing. Int perhaps. I'm thinking. Go back. Where was I? I lost my page. Here. Oh, yeah, you're right. I missed the int. Yeah. I forgot. I think I was okay, I see what I was doing. I was editing the comment, and I had forgotten. I was writing a comment to it, and I've forgotten to put it back. That's why that was going on. Keep this all nice, because then you don't have to worry about that. Okay, and then you run it in. Now it says that you're accepted. One thing to note is that this is just one result. But then you have to actually submit it, and it's going to run against all the other test cases that you have. And so you can add other test cases if you want. You need to pay for the debugger, so you can actually, put like line breaks if you would like. In this case, I'm just going to submit it, and then it will actually run it. So here we go. And it tells you all this really good stuff. And so now it tells me, okay, it ran at this time faster than 86% of the people. And it tells you, memory. It basically tells you your time and space, how fast is it in comparison to other people. So pretty good time. Not great space, but it's like good enough in this context. And so that is how you apply the umpire method. And I had spoken way too much. I had a few more problems I wanted to go through, but that is okay. And all right, so then hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that process, like I said, I know it's a lot of steps, but that was me just sitting down, talking through every single step as I did it. in real life in an interview, this would go by much faster, and also, you'll be coding as you write it. You won't be stopping and looking back on things. I think in total this took maybe like 15, like 20, 25 minutes. Which, I mean, you can do this problem in like less than like 5-10 if you know what you're doing. So just keep that in mind. But hopefully the process of understanding the problem to preparing it, see how much easier it was for me to write the code when everything was prepared, and then of course, testing it, and then we're not really doing a good job with running the time, but we did our best, and that's all we can do. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and I'm going to go back to the presentation. There's not really much else other than this. And then, the Q&A. And so now we're at the very end. Where are the links? I'm going to add that right now. Great question. So let me get you that right this second so you can see all of those links. Thank you for sticking it in with me. Hopefully that makes sense. Let me get you the link here. That was really cool. They thought about the edge cases. Thank you. I think that's definitely what's going to differentiate. Oops, sorry. That link's not going to work. Give me a sec. Hold on. There we go. Do I need to resend the link? I'm going to resend the link just in case. Use this link. The first link I sent you, it was restricted. Now it's not restricted. So everyone should see this. Feel free to use it, look at it, copy it. It's just there. Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully this was very useful to you. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Hopefully this was useful. Hopefully that process works. In terms of next time, on Thursday, same time, we're going to be covering part 3. So we're going to cover technical. We're not going to go into detail about. We're not going to cover the umpire method because we already did it. We're going to cover. We're going to a lot more coding, stacks and queues, linked lists, trees, graphs, all of those fun things that we all love so much. We're going to cover that in part 3 on Thursday. Yes, thank you all so much for being here. I'm always amazed how many people actually stay for the full 2 hours. It blows my mind. I'm deeply appreciative that you guys were here and you took the time with me. My throat is shot. I am exhausted. Literally, I'm going to log off and I'm going to go to bed. I'm so tired. Yes, thank you. I always get nervous about okay, is this going to be useful to people? Are people actually going to take things away from it? And so I'm glad that this was useful. We're going to come back for part 3 on Thursday, same time. Check the Discord for any links. And yeah, all right. Thank you all so much for being here and spending your evening with me. Have a wonderful rest of your night, and I will see you later on this week. All right. Happy hacking.